begin with 3 sounds of the bell. So, dear respected Thai, dear noble community, today is the 7th of July in the year 2021, and we're in the Ocean of Peace Meditation Hall. And we're very lucky to have many of you here this week. Last week it was just the monastics, and also this week we have Parallax here, so I feel I have to make sure my English sentences are, fully completed and and there's no dangling participles. No, we're so grateful to have all our friends from Parallax here, and this has been a class that just started with a few of the brothers who wanted to learn the core of Plum Village teachings, and Thai really was compassionate before he could no longer teach. He personally oversaw this book being compiled in Vietnamese on these 40 insights that he had developed along with all of us in Plum Village, but I think mainly Thai. Thai leading the way, insights into the Buddhist tradition, especially some areas which are not very clear in terms of how you apply Buddhist teachings into your daily life. When I first started practicing the Dhamma in my early 20s, I was getting so much benefit from sitting meditation, and part of me just wanted to consume as much Dhamma as possible. So I would just read the sutras all day long, and I would try to work just enough so that I had enough money to get food and live, and then I would study and practice, and that in my early life as a practitioner, that was most of my day, which is burying myself in books mainly, and there were only just starting to be some teachings online. I don't think YouTube was around in 2001. But there were still some monks and nuns that were putting transcripts of talks online, and so whatever I could get, I wanted to learn from. And there's some benefit to that attitude, to kind of have this a little bit of insatiability in learning the Dhamma. We shouldn't ever feel like we've really gotten it all. Usually I find when I start to think that, then I become lazy in my practice, or I think, oh, I see the book there, or I maybe have that intention to go to the monastery, but it kind of sits on a shelf, maybe for many months, many years, many decades. And that is a trap of knowledge. So we get some benefit from the Dhamma, but we put it on a shelf. And we feel like, oh, I understand that already. And then years later, when we already have a lot of anger or fear, and we've been watering that seed for a long time, we realize that, oh gosh, I missed the chance to practice. So that is a little bit of a wake-up call. We can all look in our lives and see, that time I decided to do that instead of practicing, did I really feel happier? Did I really feel more joy? And then maybe you did, I don't know. But when I looked honestly in my life, before I started practicing the 5 mindfulness trainings, before I started regularly practicing sitting meditation, I see that a lot of my days were governed by a strong emotion that came in and out. And that affected my relationships, the way I talk to my friends, the way I talk to my loved ones, my family. And I didn't recognize the habitual ways of speaking, responding to the people that I cared the most about, that were actually bringing about harm. And so this class is a fun way to just consume a lot of Dhamma. Because we can have a good nutriment. And that is the topic of this class, the practice of right diligence, and how we can nourish the positive seeds in our consciousness. So we're on the 13th tenet. On right diligence. Or sometimes we hear it as right effort. Right diligence is to practice the mindfulness trainings. So in the previous classes we learned that Thich had the insight that mindfulness is the practice of the mindfulness trainings. And in the tradition, precepts are ways of restraining ourselves from doing certain actions. And Thich had this insight to include in the precepts the practice of mindfulness. He realized that precepts are mindfulness. So aware of the suffering caused by harming beings, we make the commitment not to kill, not to hurt. Aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I am determined not to engage in sexual relations without a deep, long-term commitment, and to help to reduce the suffering of caused by all kinds of sexual abuse, by finding ways to take care of my own sexual energy as well as help others, to protect children and those who are victims of sexual abuse. So this is it brings in our insight. So it's not just about like, okay, I just control my own behavior, but I actually see that I am not separate from my community, and my actions are my true continuation. And so when I look into the suffering that's caused by my own actions, I'm also looking into the suffering that's caused by society. And I restrain my actions based on that. I remember as a kid, I grew up in Connecticut, and my dad, when he was young, he loved to go to the ocean, to Cape Cod. And in Cape Cod, they have very high dunes. And so as a kid, I learned to run up the dunes. Sometimes they're like 3-4 stories tall, very, very high dunes on the ocean side of Cape Cod. And I loved to run and jump and roll down the sand dunes. On a stony mountain, you cannot do that because you get all bloody and hurt. But on a sand dune, it's so much fun. And then at some point in the late 80s, when I was a teenager, they started to put signs up and say, "Do not climb on the dunes." And I felt very sad about that. And sometimes I still climbed on the dunes because I felt like, they just tell me not to climb on the dunes, but I'm going to do it because my joy is more important than whatever reason they had for telling me not to go on the dunes. But when I went back as an adult, I noticed that they changed the signs, and they had beautiful signs which explained that about all the different kinds of animals that live on the dunes, the kind of grass, seagrass at the top of the dunes, and also how our impact affects the erosion on the dunes. And then it invites us to not, well, I wouldn't say invite, but it allows us to be aware of why we don't climb on the dunes, instead of just putting a sign that says, do not do this. And so the original precepts are a bit like that, like do not steal, do not drink alcohol. And so Tai he got the insight, why, he was asking himself, why do we have to practice the precepts? He really looked inside himself as a young monk growing up in the middle of the 20th century. And he wanted to question everything about the Buddhist tradition. He felt very deeply that the Buddhist tradition had something to offer our world, something positive. But in order to really speak to people who are engaging in violence, drinking alcohol, all these things that the precepts tell us not to do, he could not just go to them and say, do not drink. Yeah? He needed to really go into it and see what is the basis of it. And what he discovered after many years was that the basis of the precepts is mindfulness, awareness of suffering. And so the Plum Village tradition ties very clearly all of our practices to this awareness of suffering, the first noble truth. So the practice is embedded in the trainings. That's why Tai calls it mindfulness trainings instead of precepts. So right diligence is to practice the mindfulness trainings and is therefore also mindfulness. So in the on the path of awakening, we talk about there being 8 aspects. So we learned that the basis of our way of looking at things, everything within our body, all phenomena, actually affects everything. So we need to start in how we look at the world within us and around us. So we need to cultivate right view. And mostly our practice of right view is letting go of views. So nowadays we talk about bias in journalism, in our interactions, and so we recognize that we have fear, and we have things that have been habituated within us, and those have come to us from our ancestors. Those are seeds that are planted in the way we interact in society. We start to observe them as children, and then we adopt certain views, like I should behave this way with that person and this way with another person. And we don't even notice that they're there. So we have a lot of wrong perceptions. So the path is becoming aware of those wrong perceptions and learning to let go of them. And that's why we do it in community, because in community you cannot easily just tell yourself, oh, I have no bias. I have no implicit bias. Because your brothers and sisters tell you, and they give you feedback on something you said or did that was hurtful, like an aggression or microaggression or something that for them felt very hurtful. And so that way you look, oh gosh, and you come back. If you're open, if you keep your heart open, you don't react with anger, but you see, oh, this is a gift. Someone is helping me to see, or helping my community to see how, in what ways I'm behaving, we are behaving, that is not creating an open space, creating an openness, a place that's safe. So that is also the practice of right view. So it's not only an individual matter at all, right view, but it's learning to let go of ways that we are harming, again, aware of the suffering, and learning to keep our heart open, even in the face of what we may perceive to be violence or danger. So actually these mindfulness, right, mindfulness, and concentration, they correspond to the 3 trainings that we've been studying, smriti, samadhi, and prajna. So right view is insight. Prajna is not knowledge, it goes beyond conceptual thinking. So kind of a deeper intuition that is not constructed. And we already talked about mindfulness and concentration. And with right view, then our thoughts are helpful, kinder, more beneficial. And with kind thoughts comes kind speech, right speech. And right action. Body, speech, and mind. So if our view of the world is full of fear and anger, then our thoughts are also full of anger, and our speech and our actions. So sometimes we feel, oh, I don't have any wrong perceptions. My mind is very clear. It's very open. But then something in our speech or something in our actions shows us that there's some anger. And so that's the kind of mindfulness spell. You think, oh, many times I've experienced that where I feel so open, I feel very clear, I feel like there's no discrimination. But then something that I say is something that I do, and a brother reminds me, and then that's a way for me to see I still need to practice. I still need to go back to the root and see with mindfulness and concentration what kind of harm, what kind of way of looking at things is still bringing about harmful thinking, harmful speech, harmful action. And livelihood. So right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood. And right livelihood means that we live in such a way that we are not causing harm. So sometimes the Buddha put very simply, like if we are a butcher or we are selling weapons or arms, then that's clearly a wrong livelihood, because those professions will always be causing harm to animals or to other people. But it's much greater than that, right? Livelihood is awareness of the suffering caused by maybe the way that I buy products, or the company that I work for. Does the company that I work for produce the kind of products that are helping people to be happier, more peaceful? Like if you're publishing books at Parallax, you can feel a lot of joy because you know that every book that comes out can bring joy to other people when they're in a difficult moment. Somebody will see the cover of that book and they'll pick it up, and something will draw them in. They're looking for peace and happiness. So then you sleep very well at night because you have a right livelihood. You have a kind of way of living that is actually bringing about peace and happiness. So we need to look into our life and see. And it's not only about the company that we work for, but it's also how we work, like how we are living. Are we peaceful in our office space? Is it a place of peace? Do we feel at home there? If not, what can we do? Can we have a sitting meditation? Or can we have the practice of watering flowers, like watering the positive flowers in our colleagues, in our, are we creating a space where people feel like they don't fear losing their job, or they feel like this is a community, a real community. Maybe I get a salary, but the reason I'm here is for the community. So these are things that we can look at and see. And if it doesn't fit, then we can change. We can go in another direction. And maybe we can change the environment of our workplace so that we can practice mindful walking, mindful sitting. That's what we did here at the monastery. I mean, being a monk or a nun should be right livelihood. But actually, our teacher discovered that sometimes it was not. That sometimes we would get caught as monks and nuns in just chanting, like ceremonies in order to get money. So we can have a nice temple, so we can feel like we are king sitting in our temple. And so the Buddhist community had a very strong lesson in the 20th century, especially in China. The monks for many years, many with good intentions, but they unwittingly had become the landlords who owned all of the fields around the temple. And so over many centuries, what started out as with humility and begging for food sometimes was perceived, and maybe was, kind of like being a landlord in the feudal times. And the peasant people had to work the fields so that the monks had the food to eat. So that is one of the dangers of Buddhism. You become too settled and you order a lot of things on Amazon and when other people are having a lot of difficulty, then you have to look again and see, is this really right livelihood? Am I really cultivating joy and peace? Or am I actually just living a life where other people serve me and do things for me? So that is, and that is why the contact between the monk and the monastics and the lay community is so important, because the lay community can also remind the monks and nuns of the simplicity in their livelihood. So that's so right livelihood, we should not just assume because we work for a good company or we're in the monastery that we're practicing right livelihood. We have to look deeply and see, are we creating suffering in the way, everything that we do, in our thinking, our speech, and our actions, and find ways to be kinder, more gentle. And so today we're talking about right diligence. And so Tai is saying, right diligence is to practice a mindfulness training and is therefore also mindfulness. So, right mindfulness is right diligence. We cannot separate out one from the other. And this is so important because, especially as mindfulness has become such a catch-all phrase, right, for like a company that practices mindfulness. Recently, a very famous company, they built a mindfulness booth in their fulfillment centers. Maybe I'm giving away which company. I don't know. Did you see this picture of the mindfulness booth? So you maybe you cannot go to the bathroom, but you can go to the mindfulness booth. And yeah, and I'm sure there was some good intention there, but this is where if we just get caught in a concept of mindfulness, then it loses all of its meaning. And it only becomes another way of just feeling good about ourselves, or feeling like hiding under the carpet the suffering that is really there. Or now we call it spiritual bypassing. Yeah. So we have to look inside and see: are we just creating a mindfulness booth inside of our heart? It means maybe we are a long time coming to Deer Park. We are a student of Thai. We spend a lot of time around the community, but we actually, when we look into our life, we find out that it's just a mindfulness booth. When we go to the monastery, we step into the booth, and we're very mindful. But as soon as we go out, it's there's a lot of harshness and anger, and so we need to. As I said, mindfulness is not a tool. It is a path. And that's why the Eightfold Path, these 8 aspects of the path are inextricable, every one of them, from mindfulness. You cannot just take mindfulness out from right diligence. So the Buddha taught that right diligence is made of 4 aspects. And the first is that we recognize that in us there are the seeds of anger, of despair, and we want to do everything we can not to allow those seeds of anger, despair, resentment, jealousy, and so forth to come up and manifest in our mind consciousness. So we talk about the mind having different aspects, and all of us very easily accept that there is anger in me, but right now, most of us here are not angry. So in Buddhist psychology, we have a way of talking about that. We talk about store consciousness and mind consciousness. So store consciousness are those emotions, mental formations that we know that are there, but they're not manifesting at this moment. So at this moment, I'm not angry, but I know that there is a seed of anger in me. And so you don't see it in the present moment, but you know it's there. You know from your past experience that when someone says something or does something, it might bring about a perception that gives rise, that waters that seed in your consciousness. And so the seed of anger is there, and it is touched by certain conditions. And then it comes up as a kind of flower in mind consciousness. So we learn very quickly to recognize when the seed of anger is manifesting in mind consciousness. And then with mindfulness, we know how we've been nourishing that seed. So we stop paying attention to that nutriment. Maybe it's a conversation, maybe it's the news, maybe it's a movie, or just something that in our habitual way of thinking that is consistently going and touching that seed of anger and inviting it to come up. We have to look honestly and see, we may be attached to our suffering. There are certain seeds. For example, now with the situation of the climate crisis, and if we're not careful, we can continuously touch the seed of despair in our consciousness over and over again. Instead of feeling happiness and joy, we just say, oh, the climate crisis. And that doesn't mean the climate crisis is not real. But we recognize that if we want to deal with the situation, we need to have positive mental formations. We need to recognize the danger, recognize how serious it is, but not let it water our seed of despair or anger. Instead, a skillful practitioner knows how to water the seeds of happiness and joy, to have energy to respond to the situation with skillfulness. So you know that that situation is so painful and will cause so much pain again in the future. You see it happening now, like the heat dome over the northwest last week. Yeah. Many, many stories around the world. Yeah. We have good conditions, but there are many people who don't have good air conditioning in Seattle and Oregon, and they're older, they're poor, and many people died because of the situation of the changing climate. So we're able to look at that situation and recognize the suffering, but not let it touch our seat of anger or despair. Instead, motivate us to do something about the situation. What can I do to help with this situation? We can listen to the sound of the bell. When I was a novice monk, I went with a group of young people right here at Deer Park to the Thai's old hut. And in that conversation that Thai had with us, Thai said the young people really strongly wanted to build an organic farm here at Deer Park and live very simply off the earth. And I remember very clearly also having that desire, because I lived before being a monk. I went to live in an organic farming community in Spain. And we just had some bags of rice, some wheat, and some salt and a few other condiments. And the rest of the food we grew in the fields, like all the vegetables, like cabbage and tomatoes and many carrots and things. And for the winter we would put them in cans so that we could eat them throughout the winter. And when I came to live in that community, I felt like I discovered the Garden of Eden. This is the solution to all the world's problems. If everyone could just live like this, then we would avoid the coming climate crisis. But what I learned over a few months was that there was more serious difficulties in the community. People who couldn't get along with one another. And maybe this person was sleeping with that other person, partner, and later I learned that there were some hidden fields where they were growing marijuana. Anyway, there were many things, and so we have to be really honest and look deeply, because underneath there were dynamics. And even though it seemed on the surface we were living the perfect life, but actually within a few months the community split because of all of these dynamics operating in the collective consciousness. And that was a great lesson for me when I was about 22, 23, because I really thought this will save the planet. But if we're not able to learn how to live in community, even if we know how to grow food organically, even we eat locally, we do everything perfect. Like here at Deer Park, we have solar panels for our electricity. We've done many things, but if there's not harmony amongst the brothers and sisters, I don't know, what good is it? It will become an empty shell. I'll tell another story. A few years ago, I think 2012, 2013, and we were in Thailand, and a laywoman came to us, and she loved Thai very much, and she knew that her brother had a very large hotel with many. He happened to have. He loved horses. He loved. It's called dressage. I don't know. You know what dressage is, but yeah, the horses that walk like this and they hold up their paws and do fancy things. And they had inherited a lot of wealth from their father, and he was the eldest, and so he had used a lot of that money to because he loved this sport, and he created this whole hotel where people could come and ride horses. And but later in his life, he wanted to do something for the situation with the energy production in the world, to create a green center. And so he had some buildings built that were totally self-sufficient. They had like the latest technology, all the heating, everything was like top, perfect. And so we didn't know very much about the situation, but a group of the monks and nuns, we went there because she felt something was not quite right, and she thought maybe her brother would give the center to Plum Village, and we could have a kind of wake-up center there. So a few of us went, and we stayed there, and we went on a tour with him, and he showed us around. He was quite proud of his horses, but also of all the green buildings, and he was growing algae and kind of big open kind of half like tubes cut halfway to generate some kind of biofuel. Anyway, very, very interesting things. And then when we had dinner after that, I remember asking him, well, how do you plan to build a community here? Because I noticed that there were all the people who were there, they were paid workers. And he really wanted to create a kind of community around green and solar and all these things. And he had hired a very talented engineer to build many solar panels so that so he could generate electricity not only for his center but also for many of the houses in the neighborhood. And he didn't seem to think that was much of a problem. I asked him that question. Oh, people will come because they want to, do green energy. But I thought, because I really reflected on community in my life. What is a real community? And hiring people is not a real community. And if people come here and live here, are they going to be able to make decisions, or are you just going to make all the decisions? These are the kinds of things that I asked him. But in the end, he was very confident that it would work out, and so we left. But we felt, no, we cannot. This would not work as a center for Wake Up. And about a year or two later, I heard that he had taken his own life. And what I felt so deeply was this kind of deep sadness. That even with the money, even with the wealth, the power to create everything green, everything perfect, but without community, you cannot get very far. So I don't pretend to know what his suffering is, but this was a great kind of teaching. If we don't look at the situation that we are in terms of community, in terms of brotherhood and sisterhood, siblinghood, in terms of how we can take refuge in one another, as each of us takes refuge in our own practice. And we have solar panels, even we eat everything plant-based. We have an organic farm. It will only be a shell. What we need is to look deeply in ourselves and ask, what are people for? As Wendell Berry, the poet, once asked. I love that question. What are people for? It seems like a simple question. We just do stuff, right? We go to work, we get the money, we produce products. That's what people are for, right? I don't think any of us believe that really deeply in our heart. So that is a kind of question. And so when we were with those young people, with Thai in the hut, Thai had a lot of wisdom, I could see. Thai wants to encourage the young people, but he gave an answer. He said that even we have an organic farm, but we don't have brotherhood and sisterhood, and it will not help the situation. So Thai over and over again talked about brotherhood and sisterhood. Now we say siblinghood. But Thai always said brotherhood, sisterhood. And what he meant was we need to learn how to take refuge in one another as brothers and sisters, to learn to support one another, but also to give feedback to one another. And not only just the monks and nuns, but also the lay community. We need to learn from one another, see like how can we generate joy instead of touching the seed of despair when the most serious issues like the climate crisis, like social injustice, the continuing situation of the trauma caused by slavery and the destruction of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. These are very real. But if we're not careful, we cannot do anything to help because we are so much overwhelmed by despair and anger that we just lash out. So Thai wants to help us to bring the same kind of awareness that we bring to the precepts, to the most serious issues that we're facing today. Awareness of the suffering. I am determined not to kill, not to steal, not to harm others, but always aware of the suffering and learning to cultivate joy, even in the midst of suffering. So that is the first and the second practice of right diligence. So the first is the unwholesome seeds. It means seeds of anger, despair, the kind of emotion that just paralyze us, that make us incapable of helping even us. We cannot help ourselves, let alone anyone else. So we see how those seeds manifest, and they come up in the mind consciousness. So we learn, first of all, not to allow them to come up. And we do that by not feeding them. So the unwholesome seeds, we find ways to keep them in the seed form and store consciousness. We invite them to stay down. So it's really important to understand and experience this in your own mind, your own practice. So a lot of people get confused and they think, oh, it means that I should, if I get angry, I should suppress my anger. And that's the opposite of what Thai is asking us to do, what the Buddha is asking us to do. It's kind of like you have some paper and it's burning and you put a carpet over it, but then the carpet starts burning and it's smoldering underneath. You keep the heat inside. So this is not the practice of right diligence. This is just throwing a blanket over something and trying to forget about it, or sweeping the dust under the carpet. The dust is still there. So the practice of inviting the unwholesome mental formations to stay down, to not manifest in mind consciousness, it means we remove the source of nutriment. So just like a fire that's burning, you might remove the logs so that the heat is not concentrated in the center, so that it doesn't continue to blaze. But if you've ever done that, you pull the logs out of the fire, and then they start to cool down. But if you push them close together, you keep putting fuel on the fire, it gets hotter and hotter. So our mental formations are like that. They need nutriment. And that nutriment often takes the form of our thinking, but also our what we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we smell. All these inputs, these sense impressions, are watering the seeds in our consciousness. And so we learn to mindfully consume sense impressions. And that's a big part of our practice. So in the monastery, we don't have television. Now in the past 20 years, we try to find a way to skillfully use the internet, because that's a big challenge. In the old time, monks and nuns would also get distracted in the monastery, but we have more challenges now with the internet. So we need to always find new and skillful ways in the monastery to not let our sense impressions come in that are watering the seeds of anger and despair. Yeah, so we live together in rooms together, and we have like an office where we can go to use the internet, and so we try to always do it together. So that gives us a second body. There's other people in the room, and so that already creates a lot more awareness than if we're just alone by ourselves. So these are ways that we've come up with in the monastery. And we don't do it perfectly, but the spirit is this, not to water the seeds, the unwholesome seeds in our store consciousness. Invite them to stay down. We don't want to feed them. And then those unwholesome mental formations. Maybe we say unwholesome mental formations. If they are down, they're still seeds. So when they manifest in mind consciousness, we call it a mental formation. So everything is a formation. A flower is a formation. This meditation hall is a formation. Our body is a formation. And every kind of formation needs food to survive. So we look to see in our mental formations, mental formation. In this class, we're learning some Sanskrit for fun. Chitta samskara is a mental formation. Chitta is mind, and samskara is a formation. Like a kri, kara is the same root as karma, action, something that's done, and sam means together. So it's like constructing something, forming something. Chitta samskara is mental formation. So when the seed is nourished, then it can manifest as a mental formation in mind consciousness. here in Deer Park, it's very dry. So a lot of the plants, they have to keep their nutriments under the ground in a burrow. And even if it's we don't have rain, like we haven't had rain for many months, but you still see some of the plants. Today we went for a walk in the mountain, and we saw how the manzanita burl, even we cut back some of the branches, but it's putting up new green branches. Even there's no rain. It's because in the burl there's a lot of the nutrients as well as the water guarded so that it can continue to grow throughout the season of the drought. In the same way, if we have a very strong, resilient seed, it means we've watered the seed of anger a lot. It becomes very strong. A little sapling, little baby manzanita that's tiny cannot survive the drought. But over many years, when it becomes very strong, it has the capacity, even if you cut all the branches off, it will put up new branches. So if we've habitually watered the seed of anger over many, many years, it can be like that in our consciousness. It has a lot of nutriments. It's quite self-sufficient. It knows how to get the nutrients it needs. And so only a little bit of more nutriment and it will easily manifest. But if we learn how to starve the seed of anger, starve the seed of despair, then it's more difficult for them to come up. So the unwholesome mental formation, we invite them to go back down. These are unwholesome mental formations that have manifested. We remove the fuel. We invite them to go back down. And Thai called this changing the peg. So, like our tea house up in the Brothers Hamlet, some of the pieces of wood are joined with a peg. And that was the old way of, in architecture, you join two pieces of wood with a peg. And sometimes if that peg has gotten rotten, it's quite tricky because you need to keep the peg there to keep the wood intact, but you want to put a new peg in. So to do it, you would take a new peg and you would bang it with a hammer on top of the old one. So while you're putting the new one in, you're also removing the old peg. And so that is the practice of inviting the seeds, the unwholesome mental formations, to go back down. We can also invite positive mental formations to come up, like mindfulness. The seed of mindfulness is also something that can be very weak or it can be very strong. If we live in an environment where people like mindfulness, they like to be mindful of their thinking, of their speech, of their actions, and then that makes the environment can affect the seed in your consciousness. In the same way, if we're in a neighborhood where there's a lot of violence and fear, and maybe we don't get enough nutritious food to eat, so we have to go and we learn to steal from the stores. And so everything around us is going against cultivating mindfulness. And so that also becomes part of our consciousness. So the seeds of violence become stronger. And it takes maybe more practice. Or we need to change our environment to find a place where there's people who know how to cultivate the seed, to make it strong, like the burl of the manzanita tree, so that it's self-sufficient, so that in any situation you can just touch that seed of mindfulness and it easily will come up. Maybe you forget sometimes, just like we do, and we walked quickly around the monastery, or in one moment we maybe the shopper here, he sometimes he spoils the monks and he buys bags of potato chips, and then we can eat in Plum Village we don't have that. We're much more like a little bit more poor. If there's a bag of potato chips, it will disappear very quickly. But here in Deer Park, there's a place, and sometimes you put potato chips there, and then if your seed of mindfulness is not very strong, you eat one potato chip and then another one, and before you know it, you're not mindful anymore. You're just putting potato chips in your mouth, and you like the crunchy flavor, the salty flavor, and actually many people have been tested and they do the same thing, and that's why the potato chip becomes more crunchy, more oily, more salty. I've been working with Dr. Lillian Chung at the Harvard School of Public Health, and so she's done many studies around this. They try to let people know, give the most scientifically based nutrition information, and a lot of studies have gone into how to make food more crunchy, more oily, more salty, just so you get in that mindless mood. Yeah. If you were in the, having to go out into the savannah and dig up a root that tastes like much less sweet carrot, it's very difficult to get mindlessly eating it because even though there's nutriment there, but it doesn't taste like a potato chip. But now we have, processed sugar, like access to these processed carbohydrates, which our ancestors our body never evolved to be able to handle. And so it's very easy for us to just keep feeding ourselves mindlessly. So we need to cultivate the seed of mindfulness and invite it to come up when the seed of craving, for example, manifests in mind consciousness, because that will allow us to stop and embrace our craving. I know you're there. Hello, craving. We don't have to have it's really not helpful to have this kind of antagonistic relationship with our craving. Yeah, that craving is there for a reason. It helped with our survival. We needed those nutriments. And so we needed to have a strong motivation to somehow find the nutriment that we needed in order for us to survive, in order to raise a human child. It takes so much caloric energy. 12 years usually for a human child. It's unprecedented in the animal world to raise and help feed a human child. And so it really, that craving within us is also, has some basic benefit. But the problem is that it takes over our thinking and it takes over our way of acting. And then we do things that hurt others because we want more power, we want a bonus in our job, we want a higher position. And it's all rooted in wanting to just have enough food for our children and for ourselves. So we need mindfulness to come up and say, oh, hold on, what's going on? Mindfulness helps to interrupt the process of our habits. So the third practice of right diligence is to invite the wholesome seeds. The wholesome mental formations to come up into our mind consciousness. Mind consciousness. They often said it's like when you have friends over and to your living room and you want them to stay as long as possible. So you serve them tea and cookies, and then you say kind words, you water the flowers. It means you water you speak about their good qualities so that they stay a long time. So that is the art of right diligence, is to learn that seeds like mindfulness, like concentration, like insight, are like good friends that you want to invite up, and then the last one, to have them stay for a long time. So we invite the wholesome mental formations to stay a long time in mind consciousness. And the key that I found about right diligence is that you have to do it yourself. I always try to find ways to explain it. I mean, because our mind works in metaphors with words, and so we're talking about a process that's going on in our mind. So each of us has to look inside and see, first of all, what's going on. When a painful mental formation of irritation is manifesting, and then you look at it with mindfulness, you invite mindfulness up and you say, okay, I'm going to embrace this mental formation with mindfulness. What is in the root of that mental formation? What kind of nutriments are coming in? Just like when we have the flower and it's starting to wilt, we need to look and see, is there not enough water? Is there not enough compost? We try to understand how we can water the seed of mindfulness so it's stronger, and also remove the nutriment from our anger or our despair. So this is goes way beyond. We should not mistake this practice for apathy. So a lot of times now we hear, you should get angry. And be careful. Like, we should be aware of our anger. But if we let anger take over, it may be that our actions are not actually helping the situation. So that's why we recognize how our perception, when we read the news, when we hear about some injustice, we know that if I'm not careful with my perceptions, that will water the seed of anger in me. But I see that there's suffering there. I recognize the suffering very clearly. And I know that I want to water my seeds of joy, my seeds of happiness, the seeds of mindfulness, in order to be able to act in a skillful way. What I love about my teacher is how he just kept teaching the Dhamma. And he helped so many people who are doing so much good in the world, bringing about so much transformation, to be able to deal with the most difficult anger and despair, because he himself felt that despair trying to change the situation of war in Vietnam. And he let it overwhelm, before he was able to practice this, it often overwhelmed him. And he told us that as the students, that despair is the most dangerous mental form, he said the most dangerous. There was one time he was teaching a class of students and he felt overwhelmed with despair about the situation. He saw no way out of the violence, of the fighting and the war in Vietnam. But he could not tell that to his students. He needed to find within himself something that could water their seeds of joy and happiness. So that is that's not it's not that Thai was suppressing his anger or being apathetic to the situation of the war, but he learned how to water the seeds in the collective consciousness that can bring about hope, possibility, brotherhood and sisterhood, community, so that we can, in the situation when the wave hits, we have trust, we have a place of refuge that we can go to, and not a place of chaos, not a place of mistrust, a place that is not where we don't feel safe. Yeah. Personally, I take very seriously the situation of the climate, like I think we all do, and I don't rule out that this society that we are living in may lose its structure. That is very, very likely, and every day more likely. And so I feel it's so important that we learn to trust ourselves and trust one another and build community in order to have a place that can be a place of refuge and not a place of chaos. So please find it in yourself to practice the Dhamma. It's very deep, these teachings. Many times since the time of the Buddha, the Buddhist community has been deeply challenged. And the challenges that we face today are also enormous, overwhelming. But without being able to water the seeds of joy and happiness, then it really is a situation of despair. So we need to learn how to generate joy, even in the midst of chaos. Like Thai said, in the boat, in the middle of the storm, if there's one person who can remain calm, peaceful, then they can affect the collective consciousness. It's not that there's no storm and that their lives are in danger, but he can affect the collective consciousness so that people are able to come back to themselves, hold on to the oar, and be able to keep the boat steady enough so that the storm passes. And that is possible. And that is what Thai asks us to do. And that is why this practice of right diligence is not just an individual matter, but it's about each one of us being solid, learning to cultivate that capacity. I look at myself and I say, can I be that person? And when I see that there's elements in me that are still, there's still anger, there's still irritation, then I know I still need work. I still need, everything's perfect, but I can, I can help to allow those seeds to become less strong. And that gives me joy, and that gives the greater community joy. So somehow I find myself teaching this over and over again, but I feel every time there are some things in Buddhist psychology that are very, like very interesting and very and somehow, sometimes when we learn about right diligence, it seems like, oh gosh, not this again. But it's so powerful. It's really, it's applied Buddhist psychology. So I wish you a successful practice of right diligence, and also helping all those out there who have touched the seed of mindfulness in some way to see the deeper path that is there. It's not just about being aware of the present moment, but it's about bringing up seeds of joy, watering the positive mental formations, and also inviting those seeds that are overwhelming our consciousness, like anger and despair, to go back down. Thank you for listening. I'll finish with 3 sounds of the bell.